Hey everybody, welcome back to video. So, continuing series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, and today we're continuing along with our MiSTer FPGA Nintendo 64 versus software emulation showcase, where we put the current core up against some of the leading emulators. We've already done one. This is going to be the second one we've done, and we're going to be doing Mupen64 Plus next. You guys have been requesting this, so I figured we'd take a look. Now, do be aware that this core is not finished. This is not a versus showdown. This is just comparing the two different options on the table and seeing how they differ and how they are very similar in the same right. In the bottom left hand corner, you're going to see Mr. Coon down there, the mascot for MiSTer, and when we move over to Mupen64, you'll see the logo there, so you can pay attention to what the source is and what you're looking at. And the great part is, emulation for Nintendo 64 has come a long way. It has been decades in the making. I remember being at an airport in Denver International Airport after a ski trip like 15-16 years ago with my laptop trying to emulate Nintendo 64 and having a decent time of it. That's how long this has been going on. Obviously, Robert and the FPGA core have been working for about 10 months at this point in time, and it is absolutely wild just how far he has come. Now, of course, it is Mario Kart 64, so it can be unfair, and I just got hit twice as Yoshi. Now, this was one of the first games that was running on the core. It was one of Robert's favorite Nintendo 64 games growing up, apparently, so this was one of the things he really focused on getting out the door first. I remember this was one of the first games I showed on the testing previews like 10.5 months ago, and it was amazing just to see this run, even if it was only like 2 frames per second, and you were racing around as a black box versus actually a character. But you'll see here, this definitely looks like Nintendo 64. If you didn't know I was playing on MiSTer FPGA, I could probably just tell you I had an HDMI modded console, and you would 100% believe that. That's how close and how accurate this core is, and the development has not finished at this point in time. Now let's move over to the Mupen64 source as we cross the finish line, and you're going to see it's a very similar look, but it is cleaner. Now I have reduced down the resolution as well as the internal rendering resolution to get this as close to a stock Nintendo 64 as possible, but I would say on the Mupen side it is just clearer. You have a lot less of that VI Vaseline look over the top. Now, outside of switching the resolutions, I left everything else as is stock, as this would be delivered if you just downloaded it and decided to play it in RetroArch or otherwise. And it is a very clean look. It's actually surprising just how close these two images are and just how close the performance is on both of them. As far as Mario Kart 64 is concerned, Mupen64 Plus was giving me everything I needed to get around the course, have fun, and basically crash in the exact same manner, almost in the exact same spot in the track. That's how close these two were in the comparisons. But tell me down below so far, which one do you like the look of better? MiSTer FPGA Nintendo 64 core or Mupen64 Plus? And I do know you can filter these a lot. I'm just doing a stock test here, and again, there is no conclusion to this video. It's just for fun because you guys wanted to look at it. Now moving over to Perfect Dark, you'll see here in the intro, again, it just seems like a much cleaner source, where when we move over to the Nintendo 64 source on MiSTer FPGA in just a moment, you're going to see it gets a little softer, it gets a little smearier, and it gets a little closer to what I think a Nintendo 64 would look like if you popped it into a CRT television or a PVM. You'll see the source change, and it did get that nice Vaseline look over the top. This is what I really like about the core. It does really adhere to what a Nintendo 64 would look like from back in the day. You get that blur, you get all of the different VI pipeline effects. As we switch back over to Mupen here, you'll see it just does clean up ever so slightly. Mupen64 is a great emulator, but it does feel like that software emulation, just in the fact that it looks better than a real Nintendo 64 would, where something like MiSTer FPGA looks exactly like a real Nintendo 64 would. But as we get into the gameplay here, I'm going to go back and forth in the different sources, and I think you'll see, even though they have a different look, they are still very similar. Now, the only thing on the Mupen64 side I noticed was that I did have a little bit of frame hitching here and there. I can't write that up to the emulation. It could be that something in my system happened in the background for 1 or 2 frames, but I did notice a little tiny bit of uneven frame pacing and a little hitch just in this one game. And of course, Perfect Dark is a late stage Nintendo 64 game, so it's possible that it was just hitting the emulator a little bit harder. And just so you know, the system specs I'm running on, I've got a 99-13900K. It is overclocked and it is water cooled, and I looked at the system resources and it was basically doing absolutely nothing. I think I was at like 13% utilization on all of my CPU, so it's not like I was constrained or bottlenecked by any sort of system resource. Now as we move back over to the Nintendo 64 FPGA core side, you're going to see just how much softer the image gets with those VI pipeline enhancements in the core. This just looks like a real Nintendo 64, where Mupen64 has a different look to it. But the great part is both of these are infinitely playable, and if you want to play Perfect Dark and you don't have a MiSTer FPGA, this is going to be totally fine for you, and that's the nice thing. I really just care about there being a ton of different available ways for you to enjoy retro games without having to take your Nintendo 64 out from underneath the shelf and grab your Perfect Dark cart. And trust me, I have both. But as we're here on MiSTer FPGA, I do like the look of how all of those light blooms occur, whereas we move over to Mupen64, it is a little bit more even as far as the lighting is concerned. And again, I'm sure with a lot of different filters, you could dial this look closer to what it would normally be, but this is the big difference outside of those couple bits of frame hitching I encountered in Mupen. It is just a different overall look, and like I said, you guys wanted to see some early comparisons, so I figured why not run it. You'll see here as these two character models are here, this looks exactly like Perfect Dark, but as we go back over to the MiSTer FPGA side, that blending just really gives those lights, that bloom, that softness, that glow that Nintendo 64 was really notorious for. So in this instance on Perfect Dark, I really do like how the FPGA core is handling the overall visual image versus Mupen64, but on the performance and fun side, they're basically identical. Now let's move over to a game that really is a lot harder to tell the difference. This is Cruisin' USA, one of the earliest games for the Nintendo 64 and one of the games so synonymous with the system. And you'll see here, this is a game that didn't have as much softness in the image as something like Perfect Dark has. You will see that it's sharp, it has a good image, the performance is there. This is the Cruisin' USA everyone knows, loves, and remembers from the Nintendo 64 days. Now as we move over to MiSTer FPGA, yes, the sky and the road get a little bit softer with that VI pipeline, but otherwise you're at a very similar image. The performance is good on both sides, so this is a situation in which the comparison is much closer than on something like Perfect Dark on Mupen64 versus MiSTer FPGA. But again, tell me down below, do you like the look of MiSTer FPGA or do you like the look of Mupen64? And I will show some side-by-side comparisons in just a moment so you can take a look at both sources at the same time. But with YouTube compression, I do like to try to keep the maximum view window as big as possible so you can really see the difference. But do be aware, these things get compressed, so they do get a little bit crushed down compared to what I look at on my monitor when I do these voiceovers. So you'll see here on the left we have MiSTer FPGA, on the right we have Mupen64 Plus, and they are an extremely similar image when you get the window ever so slightly down. If you take a look at the clouds in the skybox, you will see that Mupen64 is maybe like 1 to 2% brighter, and it is a little bit sharper, but otherwise in motion, it can be very hard to detect which source you're actually looking at. If I didn't label these down below, I think maybe 7 out of 10 people would be able to tell the difference, but I think a few people would be fooled. And that just goes to show just how good the Nintendo 64 FPGA core is, and how good software emulation for Nintendo 64 has gotten in the intervening years, because if you tried this 5 years ago, I think you'd have a completely different result. Now do be aware that Mupen64 is high-level emulation, which is different than low-level emulation. That would be something more in the previous video we talked about. But let's move over to the introductory sequence in WaveRay 64 here right now. I'm not going to actually tell you which source is which. One is one and one is the other, and after you've seen both of them, you're going to go ahead in the comments and guess if you want to. But take a look at the overall image, look at the water, look at the blending, look at the colors, look at the vibrancy and clarity of the image. It's really going to help you determine which source you're looking at once you go to the next source and get a chance to vote. But again, as we just go through this track sequence in WaveRay 64, it is absolutely outstanding that this can be done in FPGA or in software emulation. This is just so good. It's never been a better time to be a Nintendo 64 fan than 2023 and 2024 because we have so many options. We are spoiled for choice on how we want to play Nintendo 64. Original hardware, modded original hardware, MiSTer FPGA, software emulation. You really get a ton of options. Now let's move over to the second source, and you tell me now if you can tell the difference between these two. This is going to be hard. It even tricks me. I had to look at the actual file names in my timeline to be able to remember before I did this voiceover, and that is the fun in these sort of comparisons, trying to pick out the differences in the image, in the overall clarity, in the filtering and everything else that makes up the image of a Nintendo 64, because I will say these things running, if you put them side by side, are basically indecipherable if you shrink down the actual video window, and that is just so much fun. But there are a couple of small telltale signs in this image that I know to look for that tell me it is one source versus the other, so maybe you guys will be able to spot them. but again, it just looks so incredible whichever source you view, and the best part is, again, it's just something that everyone can enjoy. It's so wild to think how far this has come in like 10 months for MiSTer FPGA and in over 2 decades on the software emulation side. But now I'm going to show you a side-by-side source for Wave Race, that way you can see exactly what we're looking at. On the left is MiSTer FPGA, on the right is Mupen, and again, they are very, very similar. I just think Mupen's color vibrancy is a little bit more than MiSTer FPGA, and I would say the image is a little bit clearer as well. If you have any recommendations for filters to put over top Mupen64, leave me a comment down below and tell me, because I will be rerunning these tests once the full core development for the Nintendo 64 core is done. I talked to Robert about comparing these things and he was totally cool with that, but of course it isn't finished. This is just a for funsies video. And that's the current situation on the current Nintendo 64 core for MiSTer FPGA compared against the 2 leading software emulators in a little bit of a prelim head-to-head. And if you want to see any more videos like this, tell me down below if there's other games you'd love to see compared, software emulation versus FPGA. But the best part is MiSTer FPGA's Nintendo 64 core is doing amazing, and I can't wait to see what it does next. Short of that, I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.